It was an attempted overthrow of the government, although there were no political motives. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, the long-awaited Justice Department Inspector General's report was released the day we record this. And depending on who you are, either it completely exonerated top officials at the FBI and others involved in the probe of the 2016 Russia meddling with the Trump campaign or with the elections. It either completely exonerated everybody, or it was a complete overthrow of the government. Guess who said it was a complete overthrow of the government, or an attempted overthrow of the government? That would be our own 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump. Bill, it seems like once again, and I'll get into some of the details of this, and with this caveat up front, Bill, I have not read the 434-page report coming out of Michael Horowitz's office. All I have to go on really is popular reporting. I had a chance to review the Washington Post story. I listened to National Public Radio's coverage and interview with former FBI Director James Comey. And so right now we're just going really not on the, down to the details of the report, but more on kind of the political impact of this thing. Frankly, it's another one of those situations, Bill, where it seems like after all this work, millions of dollars, 1 million pages of documents, 170 witness interviews, and the Republicans all think it looks good for them and President Trump. The Democrats all think it looks good for them. And can anybody even want to pay attention to this?
Well, first of all, I think that, I really do believe that in standards and rules, and all other things being equal, let me just get that out of the way first, because I don't know much about the details of this, but all other things being equal, if it turns out that this report didn't find anything, then it didn't find anything, right? If the Mueller report comes back negative on Donald Trump, it's because there's no evidence to suggest that he did the things that he did. And if this report comes back negative, then there's no evidence to suggest that the thing was an orchestrated conspiracy and so on.
Well, Bill, that's exactly my point of this question, because when the Mueller report came back, first of all, it didn't come back right away. What we first heard was the Attorney General's interpretation of the part of the report that he read. So he gave his spin on it first. Then the Mueller report was released. A lot of people on the left and the Democratic Party said, see, look how the president tried to obstruct this investigation. And the people on the right said, see, the president's completely exonerated. Again, I feel like it's deja vu all over again.
Well, you're not going to get any double standards out of me on this, no matter how much I might like to. My feeling is that whatever people feel or whatever they think or whatever they suspect is irrelevant. The Mueller report on Donald Trump came back with no evidence of activities that would either result in impeachment or prosecution, and so that is the end result of the Mueller report. If it turns out that this report comes back and there is no evidence of that kind of thing, then that's the end of it for this report. That doesn't mean it didn't happen in either case, but the report is the report. And if there's no evidence there to convict Donald Trump, and then we find out that there's no evidence to convict these other people either in terms of these high crimes and state-run conspiracy and all the rest of it, then we just have to accept that that's the truth.
Well,
maybe we can readjust our opinion about things.
Here's the way at least the coverage of this has come down on evaluating. And as we record this, we're a day before Inspector General Michael Horowitz makes a public statement about this report that was released. And it is 434 pages. But basically, the upshot of it is this, Bill, that the investigation that was launched into the possible collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign was authorized. The FBI started that without political motive, that it was reasonable for them to do that. However, that there were serious performance failures in the course of that investigation, in particular with the FISA court application, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court that determines whether people can be surveilled or spied upon. The FISA court application had some 17 errors in that process, some of which, by the way, included an over-reliance on information that appeared derogatory and an ignoring of information that appeared exculpatory toward the Trump campaign. And Bill, you're getting both spins on this. Number one, you're saying, look, the FBI was legitimate in pursuing this investigation. The other side, the Republicans, are saying, holy cow, they made 17 major errors in the Carter Page surveillance issue alone, and some of those were over-reliance on the Steele dossier, for example, after the FBI began to discover that the Steele dossier wasn't all it was cracked up to be. That information wasn't fed back to the Justice Department and to the attorneys who were overseeing the surveillance of Carter Page. I know that's a lot to consume, but what I'm saying in all of this, Bill, is it just doesn't seem to me that this government is capable not only of conducting business, but of evaluating its own conduct.
Well, as I said at the beginning of this segment, all other things being equal. So now let me get into some of the all other things. There was no evidence that Donald Trump committed any crimes in the Mueller report. When James Comey got up and issued his report on Hillary Clinton, he gave 45 minutes of actual violations of federal law, right? It's not an opinion. It's not we didn't like it. It's not errors, and it's not made mistakes or enthusiasm or anything. Violations of federal code again and again and again and again and again, and lying about those specific instances on camera. Now, then James Comey goes on to say that we wouldn't recommend prosecution. If it turns out that this report, the second report, has that kind of information in it, then the report is not equivalent to the Mueller report. In other words, the Mueller report has already come out. The Mueller report has been summarized by Mueller. It's been questioned by Mueller. We don't know anything about what the details of this are, and we probably won't know until he gives his testimony tomorrow. Presumably it's tomorrow, or whenever he does, whenever the report's released in full. But if the report comes back showing that there are a number of things that are clearly indicative of a pattern, and it's not just errors or and it certainly doesn't seem to be just regular old errors. It seems to be a pattern of misrepresentation. Then that is different than what came back from the Mueller report.
Well, and here's why that point you're making may be relevant. And as hard as I tried to understand this in kind of an even-handed fashion, it struck me as a little unusual. I made this note to myself, Bill. One of the critiques of the IG's report about the FBI's conduct in doing this surveillance, and again, they're not fingering James Comey on this, or Andrew McCabe, or Peter Strzok, all of whom were effectively exonerated as far as political motives in launching the investigation. But the officials in the FBI were critiqued for emphasizing damaging, and I'm using the term hearsay, but damaging things that they had heard about the Trump administration, and playing down exculpatory evidence, evidence that would make the Trump campaign look better. And it occurred to me, Bill, my note to myself was, if there's no political motive, shouldn't mistakes, if serious performance failures were made, shouldn't mistakes
point. They should have been random. They should have been
random, or at least not all one way or the other.
If you're telling me, and I haven't read the report, I haven't even read the summary of the report, but if you're telling me that the report shows that the FBI did what you just said it did, constantly suppresses evidence that was exculpatory for Donald Trump and enhances or trumpets evidence that is incriminating.
I would only pull that word constantly out of there. It doesn't.
Okay,
say
enough to demonstrate a clear pattern beyond a reasonable doubt. Then whether the report comes back finding, then it doesn't matter what the report comes back finding, because the evidence is in the report that what the report sought to find was there. If the report says we couldn't find any evidence of collusion on this, but a factual breakdown of what actually happened indicates political bias, extreme political bias, then that is the evidence of the collusion. That alone is the evidence of the collusion. Then you have to start asking yourself, who made these decisions to suppress some evidence and to amplify other evidence? I don't know if the report goes into that detail. I imagine
it does talk about FBI informants, and this was where the chain of information breaks down, or so it appears, that FBI informants who learned of exculpatory evidence, for example, things that George Papadopoulos said, things that Carter Page said, that would have proven to be beneficial to the Trump campaign case of not being involved in this stuff. That information somehow did not get fed back to the attorneys who were overseeing the FISA court surveillance.
Somehow, huh?
Well, and I'm not,
So-
and Bill, frankly, I'm not trying to put one spin or another on this. It just
No,
seems to me,
but look,
for example, here's another thing. Take this: the FBI at some point heard that the CIA had a relationship with Carter Page, and they just used this phrase "relationship." The CIA has a relationship with Carter Page. About the same time that FBI noticed that Carter Page was acting in an unusual manner. But somehow that information was left out of the FISA application to surveil Carter Page. So essentially, the FBI knows that maybe the CIA is cooperating in some way with Carter Page. They don't mention that to the FISA court when they're trying to get permission to surveil Carter Page.
Well, that's evidence of a plot to remove the sitting president of the United States for political reasons. If the FBI's report, if the report showed that the FBI was diligent and that all evidence that they had collected, good or bad, as far as the outcome towards Donald Trump, were faithfully reproduced in this report, that would exonerate the FBI. But that's not what happened according to this report. So what happened in this report is that clearly bias was shown, political bias, all in one direction. And so you have evidence. You have the evidence that you were looking for. I don't know how somebody can say that we found repeated constant pattern of the FBI suppressing exculpatory evidence, amplifying incriminatory evidence.
Well,
and not
now
say
you're saying
that
the
there's
FBI,
no evidence.
what it's talking about is individuals in the FBI. And I'll tell you what James Comey characterizes this as. He was interviewed on NPR, and I heard the full interview. And Comey basically says, number one, the IG report shows that there was no treasonous, politically motivated act to try to bring down the president, that the investigation was started on proper grounds and the FBI was authorized to start this investigation. And that the other activities where the IG's office is critical of individuals in the FBI and their behavior are, Comey says, mistakes. And as the report calls them, serious performance errors, not
Comey says those things are
motivated
mistakes?
acts.
Comey says that they're performance errors and not politically motivated performance errors.
The IG calls them serious performance errors. Comey basically said that they're mistakes. And then today, the FBI director who's in place today, Christopher Wray, said they've already implemented some 40 changes in their processes to make sure such mistakes can't happen in the future. Mistakes were made, but not by Comey.
I understand. I understand. Look, the whole purpose of the show is to try and find some basis to figure out the truth according to a set of principles. And of all of the elements of the Mueller report and all of that and all of this ongoing nonsense about impeachment, the one thing that I find most distressing is that the presumption of innocence is simply not there. And I find that to be antithetical to the American system. And since I'm committed to the principles and not to the personalities, if it turns out that the FBI report is saying that there's no evidence of criminal conspiracy when this thing was launched, then I have to give Comey and the rest of them the presumption of innocence. No matter what I may actually think about it or what I may suspect about it, the bottom line is if that's what the FBI report comes back with, then the presumption of innocence forces me into that position. However, what I think deserves further investigation is this. Look, let's paint the best possible picture for Comey. The best possible picture for Comey, in my opinion, would be that agents below him, and when I say agents, I don't mean necessarily FBI agents, I mean just operatives, individuals below him, individuals below Comey, had set up a chain of evidence. They had suppressed some evidence, magnified others, and the best light I can put Comey in is that he was unaware that this was happening and was therefore acting under what he considered to be reasonable, patriotic response to the data he was getting and not getting. That's the very best light I can put it in.
And he now says that he was responsible for any mistakes. Being the director of the agency, he said, of course, I take responsibility for those mistakes that were made, and I would do what the current FBI director is doing, which is implement changes in procedures to make sure such mistakes don't happen again.
Yeah, okay. Now we get down to business. The question now becomes for me, in terms of trying to weigh this thing, how many individual events in terms of evidence skewing actually occurred. And for this, I have to go back to a story I heard about, I think it was a mathematician on the Manhattan Project, although I'm not sure about the source. I remember the argument. They said to the scientist, they said, hey, there's a great general coming and you need to buff up because this general's coming. And the scientist, curiously enough, says, well, how do I know he's a great general? Well, he wins a lot of battles. How many battles has he won? And the person introducing him, the colonel, said 5. And so the scientist said, well, that's a 12% chance of random victory. So, but he said, but bring me a general that won 10 victories. And that is the point I'm trying to make here. So if it turned out that evidence was skewed 3 or 4 times, okay, that's within the realm of reasonable probability of this being a random series of random accidents. But every single data point cuts that number in half. That's how statistics work. 50%, 25%, 12.5%. That's the whole point of the argument of the story I just told you. Every single case of a data point moving in one direction and not the other cuts the possibility of this being random in half, and then half, and half, and half, and half, and half, and half, all of that. There always remains a possibility that it could have been random. But like I said, general who wins 5 battles, well, 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 9. General who wins, 1 in 5 battles, maybe 1 in 9. General who wins 10 battles without a defeat, 1 in a million. So what I want to know is how many cases, how many individual examples of evidence skewing are there? And if we get anything beyond 5 or 6, then the statistical chance of this being random accidents becomes certainly close enough to 0 for me to have my BS antennas strongly activated by this.
Well, and to the credit of the NPR reporter who was interviewing James Comey, he hit him rather hard on this point, and he said, look, these people were from, cream of the crop that you were engaged in this investigation because you were investigating activity of a guy who was a candidate for the presidency of the United States. You were investigating something regarding one of our major geopolitical foes, Russia. And so these weren't, slouches that they put on this case. These were some of their best people. And still, somehow, it almost, Bill, it almost seems like confirmation bias, like once you think you're headed in a certain direction because you see the Steele dossier, before you get evidence that the Steele dossier may be shaky, you start going off in a particular direction. It takes a lot to turn you off that direction. And perhaps human behavior, you stop looking for things that would take you off that path.
That is a psychological explanation for what might have happened to James Comey. And it's a reasonable psychological explanation.
I'm talking about the people working on the case, not Comey himself.
Doesn't matter. I don't care. It's the whole attitude. If you believe that Donald Trump was guilty and you believe that he was a crook and you went into it, you could either consciously or subconsciously suppress evidence that you didn't like and magnify evidence that you do. If, however, that is what happened, then the director of the FBI is clearly negligent, and that the FBI has to, whoever was involved with the original process at the minimum needs to be fired. And if it turns out that there was awareness of suppressing evidence, they need to go to jail. It's not so hard to figure out. You can't tell me, for instance, that Strzok operated without any political motivation whatsoever. If you take a look at all of the actions, you could take one individual in this whole goat rodeo. If you take a look at every single action that Strzok initiated during this entire procedure, you are not going to find a 50-50 balance in terms of this thing. So if it turns out that Strzok alone, let's just say, is feeding selective data into the machine, best case scenario for Comey is that all he ever saw was the selected data. He didn't know it was selected, although I think it's his responsibility to find out. And that on some level exonerates Comey, but it doesn't exonerate Strzok.
Here's what Peter Strzok's attorney says. Peter Strzok's attorney says this independent Department of Justice report confirms what everyone who has worked with Peter Strzok already knew. In 25 years of protecting our country, his personal opinions never impacted his work as an official of the FBI.
Well, I'm going to have to take Strzok's word over his attorney's word on this one. In other words, I'm going to have to say that Peter Strzok knows his own internal motivations better than the man he's hiring to keep him out of jail. And we saw the tweets that Strzok made, and we saw the not just the allegations, the assertion that he made that they were going to be a circuit breaker to protect the American people from this terrible mistake. So if you're telling me that the attorney says that this report doesn't show any evidence of Strzok sneaking into the Watergate complex at nighttime and photographing documents and Xing things out, that's one thing. That's what an attorney's paid to say. But if the attorney is saying that he's innocent, and then we find out that all of these cases of bias in terms of the evidence become clearly there,
no,
then
he's
that's
saying,
evidence that
he's saying
guilty.
Strzok may be clearly biased, but he's never let his bias interfere with his professional work.
No, of course not. Of course not.
So one more thing, Bill, and we need to wrap this up. And this is, I know normally when we do this show, I intentionally try to state the case from the left in words as hard as I can find in order to provoke you unnecessarily. I mean, necessarily provoke you. Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, I had a hard time finding things that didn't sound like they at least deserve more study. And one of the flaws that the IG's report found in the way this was conducted was that the FBI they do briefings for candidates who are, when they get down to the final, candidates who look like they may be president of the United States. And so the FBI provides intelligence briefings for these candidates on a regular basis. And at least at one point, the FBI inserted an agent into the room of those briefings specifically so that they could hear what Michael Flynn said. In essence, they were surveilling Michael Flynn, not just there to provide the briefing. And that jeopardizes the entire idea of the FBI as an honest broker coming in and giving these different political campaigns a briefing. I don't know, Bill, how you recover from something like that. What future Republican candidate during a Democratic administration is going to want to let the FBI into his campaign to do briefings?
This is the greatest catastrophe in this entire thing, is not just the injustice that I think is being done to Donald Trump on a daily basis. It's watching the Democrats destroy the entire process of how the country is governed by law in order to score political points and in order to get back the power that they lost legitimately at the polls. This destruction, we talked before about the standard of impeachment now is just, it's like a do-over. If you didn't like the results of the election, then just we'll call for the guy's impeachment. And then we'll pull him out of office until we get somebody we like. That's not how it works. And I think clearly there's no question about this. It sounds to me, on balance, having not read the brief of the report or know anything about the report, but what it sounds like to me from what you've told me is that while the report cannot name specific names of people colluding together in advance of this, there is no question that there is a string of evidence, compelling evidence, statistical evidence, if nothing else, that this report was not conducted apolitically, that it had a political agenda.
You mean the IG's report? Or the FISA court application process and the investigation?
I can't keep track of it, Scott. What I'm saying is that if this report comes back and says that there is no evidence that James Comey got together with somebody and decided to bring down the president, that's one thing. But if it also shows that in 30 cases of evidence gathered, 25 of them were skewed towards incriminating Trump, and 5 of them were left alone, and none of them were skewed towards exonerating Trump, then you have evidence that is there. It's statistical evidence. It's not just a pattern. It depends. If it's 3 points, it's not a big deal. If it's 5 points, it's a pretty big deal. If it's 10 points, it's certain. So this is what I'm trying to say. And I want people to understand this, okay? I understand what's going on with this thing, but I also have to live in a democracy with other people. So here's what I'm trying to promote, okay? I'm trying to promote against everything that I see going on in this country. I'm trying to promote a set of standards which we used to refer to as laws. And laws are above opinion, and laws apply equally to everybody. If it turns out that this report finds no evidence of tampering or anything like that on the part of James Comey, then my respect for the law and my respect for the presumption of innocence says that I have to accept that verdict, whether I believe it or not. It doesn't matter. My opinion on it doesn't matter. If there is no reasonable evidence, if he is not beyond a reasonable doubt implicated in this, then, of course, it's not a trial, but you get the idea, the concept, the principle is the same. Then I have to accept that, whether I believe it or not. And with that said, I can also count. I can divide, and I know the fundamentals of statistics. And if you're telling me that a certain number of these data points indicate bias, then there is no question that the FBI's behavior was biased. Now the question becomes, who in the FBI did it? Who? Was it Comey who was filtering information? Was it Strzok that was sending him specific information? Was the whole thing, in fact, completely innocent? And Strzok is just a regular old patriot who just happens to tweet that he's going to, or message his girlfriend that he's going to stop this election? I find Strzok's statements difficult to reconcile with the statements of his attorney, but that doesn't surprise me.
Well, there's more information to come on this, Bill, and we'll leave it at this, but I'll just put a button on it with Attorney General William Barr, in essence, is agreeing with what you're saying and disagreeing with one of the key conclusions of the Inspector General's report. The Attorney General said that the FBI launched the investigation of the presidential campaign, of Trump's presidential campaign, on, quote, the thinnest of suspicions, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. It was also clear from its inception that the evidence produced by the investigation was consistently exculpatory. And not only that, but the Attorney General has appointed an attorney to conduct an investigation of his own.
And that's the only thing that matters. The Attorney General has the power of law behind him. And if the Attorney General thinks that there's enough evidence to warrant at least a further investigation, then that gives me a great deal of hope.
I don't want to give the wrong impression. The Attorney General already had an attorney named John Durham at work on this, a parallel investigation, essentially.
Well, there should be 300 attorneys at work on it, because I watched the Attorney General of the United States listen to a 45-minute indictment of a presidential candidate on the part of the director of the FBI, who then said that they should not prosecute this case, and the Attorney General agreed. I mean, let me just wrap it up with this, Scott. There comes a point when you really just have to say, what do you take me for? When Michael Jackson says he's never had plastic surgery ever, never, ever. No. What do you take me for? I mean, I can't prove in terms of here's the day and here's the time where this happened, but put aside legal questions of guilt. What do you take me for? Right? So that's where we are now, and that's how ugly things have gotten in this country, and how lawless they've gotten in this country, because these people cannot accept the fact that the American people decided to disagree with them. And so we know that the evidence that Donald Trump actually did anything is essentially zero, because God knows there would have been enough people on this case by now. It's the Sarah Palin effect, right? They sent 400 investigators or something to Sarah Palin's background, and Barack Obama gets a Girl Scout asking him a question about what his favorite color is. I understand how this bias system works, but ultimately, when it's all said and done, if we don't respect the rule of law, even though our opponents don't seem to care much about it, then we have to start asking ourselves some very serious questions about how far we're willing to go to fight against people who have no respect for the law at all and have no sense of integrity at all and will say anything at all. And I'm already well convinced that we're dealing with people like this. So now the question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it?
We will follow up on this story as events warrant. As we record this, we are the day before the Inspector General makes his public statement about his report, and I'm sure as people unearth additional details from this 434-page report, we'll have additional details ourselves and comment on it as necessary. We're grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this show possible. In addition, our friends over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, have come alongside of us in a co-promotional effort to advance the same kinds of principles and ideas, our common heritage, and we are grateful for their support as well. We'll provide a link to the Patriot Post in the description below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this happen.